My name is Derek Douglas. I'm the Vice President for Civic Engagement and External Affairs at the University of Chicago, and it's my privilege to be here with you tonight to introduce this panel. In my role at the University of Chicago, I focus on the ways in which the university can have an impact in the city, in our communities. One of the areas that we've really been focusing on of late has been the university's connection to the private sector and corporations to both partner around research, civic activity, our innovation and entrepreneurial work, and the like. And so we're really delighted to have a private sector and civic leader like Ann with us tonight, who you'll hear from momentarily. I want to just introduce Ann before we tee up the panel, so I'll be very brief and we'll get to the main attraction. As the Senior Executive Vice President and CEO of Exelon Utilities, Ann Pramaggiore is responsible for the largest electricity and natural gas distribution company in America. The company serves some 22 million people across the District of Columbia, Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And I'll add that Exelon has been a tremendous partner to both the University of Chicago and to Argonne National Labs, which the university manages. And Ann serves on the board of Argonne National Labs. I'm also on the board, so I'm privileged to have her as a friend and a colleague on that board. Before Ann got promoted last spring, she was already an industry leader closer to home, where she was the president and CEO of ComEd, which is Illinois' largest utility, delivering electricity to 4 million customers here in Chicago and Northern Illinois. Ann joined ComEd in 1998 to work on the company's transition to competitive energy markets, and she played a central role in the restructuring of the Illinois electric industry. In the 2 decades since she joined ComEd, she's continued to work at the forefront of energy policy in the state. She guided ComEd's implementation of the Smart Grid Law, a multi-billion-dollar effort to modernize Illinois' distribution infrastructure and update its regulatory policy. And at the community level, she's also been active, where she's led the creation of programs at ComEd to encourage young women and minorities to consider careers in energy and construction. All this is to say that Ann is really the ideal person to have here today to talk about the future of the utility industry in this country. There are a few questions that they will probably touch on that I wanted to just pose as some of the challenges that are being faced today in the ever-changing landscape of energy. So some of the questions that I think are critical are, how have major providers like Exelon dealt with the challenges posed by new competition from smaller suppliers and distributed generation? How have renewable energy sources changed the industry? And what are the next generation technologies we should be looking forward to? How are utilities and their customers dealing with climate change or not? And what more needs to be done? And what is the right role for policymakers in all of this? Ann is going to be joined tonight by Michael Greenstone, who you all know well. What you may not know is that Michael and I served in the White House together, where we were kind of like the odd couple. I was at the Domestic Policy Council, he was at the Council of Economic Advisors, and we would often team up from totally different angles to push similar policy priorities in infrastructure, energy, housing, and the like. And he's been an absolutely tremendous leader since he joined the university in many ways, including EPIC and BFI. So Michael is just to be formal about it, he is the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics, the college, and the Harris School, and the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, which is our host for this evening. So with that, Ann, thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you, and I'll turn it over to Michael to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Derek. As Derek referenced, when we worked together in the White House, people would usually see the economists as like kind of the cranky people in the room, which we did a good job in developing that reputation. And then on rare instances where we wouldn't stop being cranky, Derek and I would find a way to agree. It would blow people's minds. So it was fun to work with Derek, and it's great to work with him again now here. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be
We're very excited
here.
to have you here. So there's a lot to talk about with respect to distribution companies, but I really do think the first order burning question is, you were a theater major as an undergraduate.
I was.
And I wondered if you could talk about what happened. Things seem to be right on track.
There's a lot of water that went under the bridge between that point in time
And we have a lot of students
today.
here I think would be interested in understanding your path.
Yeah, I was a theater major, and as all good theater majors do, I had two choices when I got out of school. I could either wait tables or I could work in a department store. I chose the latter, and I ended up actually in their management training program, and I spent 6 years as a buyer for a department store chain. And I sort of happened upon it. But what was great about that is I learned how to run a little business. I mean, basically, you get your budget every month. You go to market and you make decisions about what to buy. If it doesn't work out, you have to get your markdowns in, and you hope at the end of the day there's some margin there left for the company. So for a theater major, I got to learn.
That buyer by buyer.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And so as a theater major, I learned how to run a little business, and that was a great start. But I didn't want to do that forever. I ended up going to law school here in town at DePaul, and then practiced law for about 10 years after that. I was an antitrust lawyer. And about the time the Restructuring Act was passed in Illinois, ComEd was looking for lawyers because they were moving into more of a market-oriented structure for the business. They were looking for lawyers who understood markets and market rules. And I got a call and decided that it was a great opportunity to see. It was really the last fully economically regulated industry go through restructuring. Transportation had gone through restructuring, telecommunications had gone through restructuring, and really the energy business was the last of the big three. So it looked like a great opportunity, and it's been a tremendous experience the whole 20 years that I've been at ComEd.
What are your friends doing who you majored with as undergrad?
Oh, well, a couple of them have had some, spots in movies, but most of them are teaching. Most went back to school and got teaching degrees, and many of them are teaching.
Excellent. So I want to talk a little bit more about deregulation, but first I was just trolling around on the internet this afternoon, and I came across the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century, put out by the National Academy of Engineering.
Yep.
So this clearly, my children did not get to vote on this. The internet was number 13. TVs were, where are TVs? Radio and television is number 6. Computers are 8. Automobiles are 2. Airplanes are 3. Do you know what number 1 is?
Yes, it's the electric grid.
That's right, the electric grid. So why is it seen as that?
It changed the world.
It changed the world. You can just flick a switch and guaranteed there'd be electricity.
Powered a massive U.S. economy in the 20th century. It changed quality of life for millions in this country. If you think about rural electrification and what that was able to do. It has created, the digital economy that we have today and all the innovation. It's either you need electricity to power it, or electricity to create what the new innovation is. It's all, the power grid is the foundation for really our world today in very many ways.
Excellent. So can you explain, because we have some electricity nerds in the room. They all have little tattoos. They've covered up for being embarrassed, but they have.
I think I brought some of my own.
Yeah. But can you explain the role that distribution companies play in the greatest invention of the 20th century?
Yeah. So if
with a particular eye on what happened before there was deregulation. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you will indulge me, I'd like to do a bit of a historical perspective on this because it's Chicago history as well, and I think it's interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to people in Chicago. But Chicago is really the epicenter of the electric industry. And if you go back to the dawn of the industry, sort of the turn of the last century, Thomas Edison sent his private secretary, Sam Insel, to Chicago to figure out if he could figure out a business around these light bulbs. Sell my light bulbs, figure out a business around it. And what he actually did was created the industry that we have today. And it's pretty much, the fundamentals are very much as it was back then. And he did three things, Sam Insel, that were three major innovations that hold today, but are being disrupted. And we can talk about that next. But what he did was, he looked at the electric industry, which was very fragmented. There were small dynamos sitting around the cities serving small neighborhoods, and he sort of cobbled them all together and tied them to a technological innovation, which was central station generation. There was some central station generation at the time in other places. New York had Pearl Street, but the really big one, the one that really made the difference, was Fisk Street Station, which is now retired, but it's a coal plant in Chicago on Cermak Avenue. And it was at the time the biggest.
That's the one in, is that the one in
There's,
Pilsen? Or no?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Okay, yeah.
And at the time, it was the biggest machine in the world. GE made the turbines, and GE complained that they didn't think they could make turbines that big. And Sam Insel actually cut a deal in terms of how they manage the risk through that. But so first innovation is he created the first big central station machine. Second innovation was he figured out.
We're going to come back to this in a couple minutes. Now, do you want to just talk about what was so great about the central station plant?
Yeah, so that will be the second innovation.
Because now we kind of there's seems like there's a flavor appearing of people wanting to produce their own electricity.
Right, yeah, no, it's distributed. But but the central station generation machine created efficiencies, and it brought people together, and it made power cheaper. And in part, it made power cheaper because of the second innovation that Sam Insel put forward, and that was pricing. And he figured out the more and more units of sale, the more and more customers he could bring to this central station machine, the more units of sale over which he could spread his fixed costs. And so he brought more and more customers on it and drove the price down and down. And so I compare it to Jeff Bezos talks about the Amazon flywheel. And what he says is, I have this platform business, and as I bring customers to the platform business, it attracts more sellers. The sellers attract more customers, who attract further more sellers. And I create this dynamic, which he calls the flywheel, that the more customers and more sellers I have, I get to spread my costs over more units of sale. It gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The original flywheel was this business. So the second innovation was his pricing. The third innovation was as certain political entities started to see that this was a lucrative business, they decided that they wanted to be part of it. And he decided that he would create this idea of a regulatory model, and he would set it up under state control. And so he would trade off certain amount of control for the certainty of this regulatory model, which is I earn a rate of return on my investment. The rate of return is set at a state regulator. It's a moderate rate of return, but it's a certain rate of return. So I trade the upside for certainty in my business. And that was his third innovation. So all of that really still holds today, but it was created right here in Chicago. But that's all of that is also being disrupted today.
Yeah, and so do you want to, that's great, and do you want to talk a little bit about, there was a wave of deregulation as you referenced, maybe that moved you out of being a buyer at a department store indirectly into your current position.
So the first disruption of our industry really started back in the 90s. And that was the first wave of restructuring, which was to take these central station generation units and move them out into markets. So rather than have them set, the pricing set by the regulators, the generation side of the business was moved out into markets, regional markets. And that was sort of wave one of restructuring, and that's what I jumped into in the late 90s.
So before that, the guys who produced it were the same people who delivered it?
That's right. We were all a vertically integrated utility is what you would say. You own the whole value chain. You run the plants, you distribute it over the wires, you manage the customer service aspects, vertically integrated. And that was a major change in the late 90s to that. And there are still utilities in the country that are vertically integrated, but probably 20-ish, 23 states have restructured.
Okay, and so then what does restructuring bring?
So restructuring.
And then you maybe talk about which part of that you're focused on now?
Yeah, so restructuring drove the utilities to separate generation from the wires.
Yeah.
So the delivery business from the product generation. And the product generation went off into markets, really structured markets. They still regulated at the federal level, but regulated much less intensely than the wires and poles. I'm on the wires and poles side of the business. We pretty much had the same business for the last 20 years, but we are now seeing the next wave of restructuring is happening in our side of the business, and driven in significant part by technology changes. And you were talking earlier about the shift from central station generation to distributed generation. And that's one of the huge shifts we're seeing in technology that's driving some additional disruption of our business.
Yeah, so maybe we could talk about some of those disruptions. So one of them, maybe the most boring one, but is demand doesn't seem to be growing very much.
No.
So I think we looked up some statistics if I could find them, but it's basically projected to be flat for the foreseeable future, I think.
Flat or slightly negative.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a tough business to be in.
Yes. Well, it is, particularly when you think about, and I'll go back to one of Sam Insull's innovations, that volumetric pricing.
Yeah.
When you tie your pricing to consumption and you're counting on more and more consumption to drive your cost or your pricing down to customers, but you're largely a fixed cost business, very tough proposition, and that's one of the big issues that we deal with
Okay,
today.
so we got that. Then it turns out that this central station thing that seemed like a great idea because it was reducing costs, people don't like that. They want to produce their own electricity, I think.
We are the United States.
Yes.
Everybody
yes.
wants
Okay,
democracy and energy.
I like to call that locavore electricity.
Yeah.
And then you have like mandates on certain kinds of electricity being sold from renewable portfolio standards that require renewables. And a lot of these new sources are intermittent, whereas like that iconic power station was not intermittent.
No.
And I wondered
24/7,
if
you can count on that.
24/7. So all of that, and I think we were just talking about this upstairs. People don't really like their prices moving around a lot. So can you just talk about how you aim to manage all of that?
Yeah.
And,
So-
and just, I think probably some people will see it right away, but even just explaining what some of the pain of trying to run a grid is, yeah.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of strategic work in trying to think about the future of the business because, you know, we make very, very long-term investments in the business, so you need to look out and think about what you're doing. And we also have a very interconnected system. You sort of tweak one piece of it and, you know, the impacts reverberate around the system, so you really want to think about what you're doing. You know, there's a, I think, Silicon Valley phrase, move fast and break things, you know, which is a, you know, sort of phrase that is used in, you know, disrupting industries, and we want to be innovative, but we also know that we have an economy to power and, you know, a grid to run while we're creating this new grid. So that's part of the reason for spending so much time thinking about it. But you know, three real drivers of change for us: technology, as you said, distributed generation, renewable generation, intermittent generation. So we've built a system that is used to taking power from central station generation that's usually situated remotely and pull it over transmission line and distribution lines to population centers. Very static, very stable, 24/7. Coal plants, nuclear plants, you can count on them. You know what they're going to do. If you need to ramp them up, you ramp them up. If you ramp them down, you ramp them down. They're very available. Now we're going into a world where, and the industry controlled all those plants. So now we're going into a world where people have rooftop solar. So they can throw, you know, the sun shines, the clouds part, and all of a sudden you have power on your grid that you didn't count on. We're a business that doesn't store. We don't have much storage, so you have to balance in real time, and you can't get it wrong, or you can lose the system. And so we're trying to figure out how we deal with that.
So can I pick up one piece of that? So I actually don't have solar panels, but suppose I did, and I wanted to sell them into the grid, sell the excess electricity into the grid. Doesn't it seem fair that I should get the same price I'm being charged?
Well, so you want to talk about net energy metering. Yeah, so what we would say is, and you do, today in Illinois, that's exactly how it works. We would argue that...
I'm providing this electricity. You guys get to go do whatever you want with it.
Right, but we would argue that you should pay for usage of the grid because you're still using the grid. And part of what you don't pay for...
Yeah, so I want you to explain that part, because I'm not sure everyone gets that part.
So,
because there's an inherent, the locavore thing, is it's just fair. Like, I'm producing this electricity, why should I get paid anything different than anyone else?
So I'll start with, there's two basic parts of your bill. One is the energy that you're using, and the other is the use of the distribution and transmission system. And so when you have solar power and you want to sell solar back onto the grid, you should get paid for the energy part, but the use of the grid, we think that you should be paid for. The way the net energy metering credit is designed right now is you get paid for both the distribution portion, the use of the grid, and the energy. So in other words, you get a discount or a credit on the use of the grid, even though you're still using the pipes and wires to get sell your power back and get it back onto the system.
Why are the prices like that? I don't understand that.
So largely because
So what would be the ideal way? It seems like I should just pay some fixed cost for having access to the grid.
Yeah,
and
I think we would say.
Yeah, but no state really has it. I don't understand.
No.
Yeah, why is that?
So we're in a disruptive world, and when competitive industries get disruptive, the battle is played out in the market. When regulated industries get disrupted, the battle is played out in policy space. So we have entrants, solar providers, storage providers, and you have incumbents, utilities. And there's been a policy battle going on for a long, long time. And so the solar providers were actually very effective in convincing policymakers that this was necessary, this kind of credit was necessary to sort of animate or jumpstart the solar industry and the solar market. And that's and so the policy was set very early on in most states, and that's So one of the things that we look at,
being that
the policy,
I get credit, I don't have to pay for the use of the distribution system.
That's again in most, I don't know, where do we have probably three-quarters of the states have a net energy metering statute, and that's generally the way they're designed. They're all a little bit different, but they're generally.
I don't have to pay for it, who's paying for it?
Somebody else is paying for it.
Sam?
Yes. 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 Sam's paying for it. I'm probably paying for it.
My
yes.
Production. I'm producing from the sun.
So the challenge with energy, if you're not producing it, you don't have to pay for it. But the grid piece is 96% fixed cost. So the fact that you're using less energy, you're not using less grid. The grid is still there, and you've got to spread those fixed costs somewhere. So they do, we call it a cost shift. The cost would be shifted to customers who don't get that credit. So
that's what this disruption is we're fighting over who's going to pay for the fixed cost?
Well, I think one of the things that we do, we are very concerned about and we're looking very closely at is the question of how costs are allocated and how benefits are distributed. One of the things I think the industry has done very well for 100 years is assured that the benefits of the electric system were equitably distributed. Rural electrification, everybody had access. There was very much a concern over vulnerable populations and the ability to pay. And then the allocation of costs was also something that was debated in public settings and with an idea toward fairness and
so
economic
development.
The
equivalent of why it's just one postage stamp to go to the farthest reaches of Alaska versus everyone pays the same price.
Yeah. And so, and people pay different groups of customers pay different prices, but it's set in an administrative setting. People weigh in. There's all sorts of voices that are heard in that discussion. One of the things that we do, we're very focused on is ensuring that those social benefits, the benefits are distributed equitably and the costs are fairly allocated. And when you have people who are pulling pieces off the system, you have the risk of disrupting that balance. And that, I think, is one of the big questions that we see that needs to be resolved as we work through this transformation.
Excellent. And now, we talked a little bit about this before, but the setting aside, which I think is probably not right, but setting aside the fixed cost part, I just want to return to the intermittent part. And I think that means that the cost of providing electricity or buying electricity that you guys are going to then sell, that Exelon will buy from the power markets and then sell to people like me, varies over the time of the day. And so like when the sun is out, it might actually be very cheap because there's just tons and tons of low marginal cost energy. So actually, there's something, I don't know if Derek and I worked on this. I worked on this, but smart meters. Mm-hmm. That was going to be the solution to kind of like everything. Like every economist was thinking, oh my God, we can finally get this right. We had smart meters, but because they all had in the back of their mind, it's going to be bundled with real-time pricing. And everybody's going to have real-time pricing. How's that going?
Well, so let me start with this. Let me start with the smart meters.
Derek always sat on the other side of the room for me.
Let me start with the smart meters. The smart meters are a tremendous benefit. They've been a tremendous benefit to our system in a number of ways. On the operational side, we now have visibility onto the grid that we did not have before. I know everybody thinks we see everything, but literally we go into a storm situation and you have a fault on the grid and you wouldn't know where it was necessarily. You'd kind of have a neighborhood was out, but you'd have to send crews out to sort of run, walk lines to figure out where it was. With the smart meters, we have visibility to the customer home and we can see where things are happening on the grid. It's a huge benefit to us operationally. That's one example. We now have the tools to start to create the kind of pricing that you're talking about. We can actually measure at a much more granular level what's happening in terms of pricing, and so it creates the foundation for being able to do what you're talking about, which is measuring price locationally and temporally. And we would never be able to do that without the smart meters. Now the challenge is how you actually work that into a pricing system, which, as I've just indicated, is a socialized pricing system. It's all interconnected, and it's allocated administratively, and that's so the challenge is, and then the customer acceptance of that. Customers have been.
I think people would be interested. Suppose, like in the wildest fantasies of economists, where there was true real-time location and price. Like, how many nodes are there? Do you want to describe what a node is?
Oh gosh. A node could be.
Would it be possible that someone in this room would pay a different price than me?
Of course. Yeah.
Even in the same minute in time?
Could, certainly,
okay,
depending
so
on where. Yeah. So I mean, at a very fundamental.
That's very unfair unless mine is lower.
At a very fundamental level, that's usually the. That's usually the case. At a fundamental level, every customer is a node. You could look at it at that granular level. There's also nodes that come in from the wholesale markets that they tap into our system at different levels. And I'm looking at Joe Svahul. I don't know how many nodes we have coming in from.
I know when we looked at distribution, it'd be potentially tens of thousands.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, the idea is there's a point at which you can measure power, how much is coming in, and you can associate a price with it based on time of day. When we see peak periods, which run from, say 1 in the afternoon till 6 o'clock at night, and people are using more energy, prices are higher. There's more demand. It's a pretty, simple concept. But also where you're situated on the grid may play into how it's priced as well. So if you're sitting in a very constrained area, hard to get power in, we don't have a big pipeline into that area, and
Long Island, I've always seen these maps. Long Island has enormously high,
Yeah, well, islands are tough. I mean, Puerto Rico situation there, Hawaii. There's been a lot of new activity in Hawaii around their system again because they're very isolated, and you don't have a lot of lanes in to bring power in and options. Optionality is great for for managing pricing. But so if you think about being in the middle of the day, peak time period, high demand, and then you're in a constrained area of the grid, your price is going to be higher than somebody who is in a less constrained part of the grid at 9 o'clock at night. So that's time-based and location-based pricing. So if you start to think about customers who we have trained for 100 years to expect to pay an average price, it doesn't really change. Sometimes we change it for seasons, but not much more than that for the most part. And they're used to paying the same price, you and I pay the same price, and you start telling them that where you live, just by happenstance, may create a higher price than where I live. That's a pretty tough culture change shift that we have to make.
Yeah, no, why is that so hard? People pay different prices for all kinds of things. Airplane seats.
Yeah,
is that just history?
I think
there's
it
like
is.
a famous line from the godfather of Singapore, who sends like all the best and brightest to Kennedy School, and they learn basic economics, probably like real-time pricing and things like that, and then they come back to Singapore and they just implement it. And he's said, like, what's the matter with you in the United States? Like, you're teaching everyone what to do and you don't do any of it.
We're different. No, I think electricity is different. Electricity, so.
But is that just different because of the past? Why does it have to be that way?
I think because it's policy-based. So when I think about, so I had this woman that I worked for when I first came to ComEd, and she said, I light candles every morning to these gods in this business. One is the god of physics, so the system has to work. The god of economics. The economic system has to work financially. It has to line up. The god of policy and the god of politics. And so when you think about that brew,
that's a tough intersection. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it makes it exciting too. It's a great industry for those reasons.
Do you want to talk about nuclear? We hear about it some in Illinois with respect to ComEd, and just have your viewpoints on the future of nuclear and.
Yeah, we think.
Homer Simpson works at a nuclear plant, and like, is he going to continue to have a job? There's a lot of people concerned about that.
It's a very tough industry right now. So I'll first start by saying we think it's very important. It is zero carbon energy, and when you read the the recent IPCC report, the UN's report, scientists' report on climate. That basically says we got about 12 years to kind of get ourselves in line to meet roughly Paris goals, or we're going to start seeing some very, very significant effects of climate change. You want to make sure you have those nuclear plants around, both because you're not going to be able to put renewables in place quickly enough to meet those goals, and secondly, because we haven't quite figured out how to run a grid with all renewables yet. We still need some, spinning rotors to actually start motors on the system, and we do not have a system that's dynamic enough and automated enough to deal with the intermittency of distributed and renewable power quite yet. We're getting there and designing it, but we're not quite there. So we think.
I've often wondered about it. Is that really true, or is it just that we wouldn't be willing to pay for it? Because like my engineer friends, they feel like they can do anything.
Oh, I think we can build it, but we're not. We don't have that yet. I mean, we've got to put artificial intelligence on We're going to put sensors all over the system. It's going to be run by an artificial intelligence. Everything's going to be automated and computerized. So when the clouds part and the sun shines, you don't have somebody sitting in a control room who has to make a decision about shutting down the central station to allow the solar on. The grid is going to automatically do all that, but that is not on the grid at this point. We have some work to do, yeah. And then, we have to have the policy debate on what the cost of that is. But so we're not there yet with what the grid needs to be in terms of adapting to the renewables in the way. We will get there, but we're not there. So we think nuclear is important as that fuel that sort of gets us there. The challenge we have right now is that natural gas glut, which has been a huge boon for the economy and for the country, has driven prices for energy way, way down. And when you're running a nuclear plant and you have the kinds of security costs that are required to run a nuclear plant, not that we argue with any of that, but very important things, but layers of costs that are on this kind of business, it is very hard to recover enough in the energy markets to cover the cost of those plants. So some of them are hanging in there, others are, it depends on how efficient the plant is. The larger plant, the dual unit plants tend to do better than the single unit plants. They're just more efficient. You need less people to, run a dual unit plant, just per megawatt hour proportionally. But so it's a challenge. So there's a lot of discussion about that. About losing the nuclear plants. The other thing I would say, and this will, should resonate at University of Chicago, and that is, we are, we've been the leaders in nuclear energy. The first nuclear reaction was right here at University of Chicago. And to the extent we lose those skill sets and we don't have a commercial outlet for some of those skill sets, I think we lose something in the sort of international, the global picture on nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, all related. And I think we want to, and I think having, nuclear plants in this country and, having a commercial outlet for some of those skill sets, keeps that talent, that skill pool growing. And I think that's important.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask maybe yet another totally unfair question. Exelon now supported a carbon tax, an initial level of $40 per ton, then rising over time, which was, I think people were very impressed by that, rightly so. If the nuclear plants couldn't operate profitably with a $40 tax per ton, would that be fine?
Well, I think we recognize that there are certain plants that if absolutely, yes, we would say yes. They can't, there are certain plants that aren't going to be economic to run and they ought to be shut down. In fact, we have done that. Yeah, we've got one that's, one out east that's on the, being shut down right now. We just shut down Oyster Creek. Mm-hmm.
And what did, I guess, any background on where did that $40 number come from? And
yeah, I don't know the math behind that one.
But it seems like, at least on the distribution, I understand Exelon has a generation and distribution, but on the distribution side, it seems like that shouldn't matter to you what kind of electricity you're serving up,
no.
Right? It's all the same.
No, but I think we have, that is true. But I think we are, we have a strong commitment to, financially, economically, for our distribution companies, we are indifferent. Yeah. We do not make money off of the power, and we deliver it. That's what we do. And so, but we absolutely have a commitment to a clean economy. We think that that's very important, and we think we have a central role to play. We actually think our business can be very, very instrumental in making that happen. We've got a platform business. We actually think of ourselves as one of the original platform businesses, and
absolutely,
we can. Over that platform, provide customers with, energy efficient options, and if customers want to, control their own power and make sales, we can be the platform for those transactions, and we think that's a really important role for the future.
And then I think a natural question, because there's so much infrastructure involved in distribution, is the climate is changing. Have you guys started to take that on board into planning, and what does that look like? I'm always fascinated. While we debate whether or not climate change is real, I think a lot of private sector companies are just doing stuff.
Yeah. No, we have, I'll sort of talk big picture, and then I want to talk about a couple things we're doing right in Chicago that are pretty exciting on that front. So big picture is we've developed a maturity model for grid development, and we've got 5 stages. But the 3 key stages are developing the grid for resiliency to climate and, frankly, cybersecurity risk. Stage that is developing the grid to adapt to distributed generation. And then the 3rd stage that is critical I'll talk about is thinking about electrifying more and more sectors of the economy, electric transportation, potentially the industrial sector, which generates about 22% of the carbon emissions in this country. If you can get the industrial sector, power 28%, transportation 28%, and industrial 22%. If you can clean the stack and electrify those two other sectors, we've gone a long way to decarbonization. So we're putting together a roadmap on, developing the grid along that path.
Which, by the way, would be an enormous game changer in terms of altering the projections of flat demand growth, right?
Oh, absolutely. If transportation, and yes, absolutely, no question about it. It actually may not be as much of a growth engine as, it's not going to take us back to the days of the 60s or 70s, but it does offset some of the decline, and we pick up a little bit as well. So that's kind of the big picture. If I jump down into some of the things that we're doing, we're looking, at where floodplains are, and do we have substations in floodplains, and do we have to lift them up? One of the really, really interesting things here, and Terry Donnelly, the president and COO of ComEd, is here, and just finished putting together a plan with a superconductor cable company. It's partly supported by Department of Homeland Security, partly our money, partly their money. This cable is low impedance, high capacity. It will ultimately tie 4 or 5 substations together in the central business district of Chicago in a way that couldn't be done before, and really network them so that if you lost a substation, you could actually lean on the excess capacity from another substation to keep the central business district up and running. You can't do that today with any cable that exists. We're starting out with a small pilot in one of our own substations to test the cable and make sure that it works and safe and reliable and all that. One of our, right on California and Addison substation. And then the next stage will be to take that through, and so that, if we find ourselves in a situation where we, have a climate threat and, we lose a substation, we can keep central business district up and running. So those are some of the things that we're doing as we think about, that climate
So
risk.
a changing climate has entered your calculations?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. In fact, that's what Joe Swahula is working on, engineering plans around resiliency for all 6 of our utilities.
Are there any, secret is the wrong word, but like especially exciting like engineering issues that you haven't touched upon that are at work here?
Yeah, some great engineering projects.
But if you're going to be the #1 of the 21st century too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I can talk about our microgrid in Bronzeville, and Bruce Montgomery is here tonight, and he is one of our partners in the Bronzeville community. And this really takes, the concept behind this. So we're building energy infrastructure in the community of Bronzeville, but the whole idea is to try to help this community sort of define its own energy future. And so it really takes, I talked about our maturity model and those 3 main areas. This is really taking it to the ultimate, which is, so we've talked about, local, this sort of localization trend. This is sort of the ultimate in the localization trend, but we're building a microgrid in Bronzeville. It is partly sponsored by DOE, and it will connect, the ComEd microgrid will connect to a microgrid that already exists at IIT. And the DOE grant money that we got was to design a controller that allows for dispatch between these 2 microgrids. It will be the first microgrid cluster in the world that allows for dispatch of generation between 2 microgrids. So we started out with this really cool technology project. And we said, but we really want to work with the community, and we want to see if we can sort of create, some energy, for lack of a better word, around this, experiment in electric technology. And so we added some things. We brought the community in, and we added some things to it. We partnered with an electric vehicle ride-sharing company out of Burr Ridge, and we have a first mile, last mile ride-sharing project going on for seniors in the community. We added some solar and battery-powered lighting to park areas that the city streetlights don't reach to create more lighting. We put in a community kiosk in the center of Bronzeville, or we're in the process of doing, I don't know if we finished that one yet, but it will have information on transportation, what's going on in the community. The power that's going to power the microgrid is in part solar, and we have a firm that we're buying the solar from. They're putting the panels on one of the public housing units in Bronzeville. They will sell the solar to the microgrid. They will also sell the solar to residents in the housing units. And
At the retail price?
actually, I think it's a pretty good. Yeah, I think it's all good for the residents. Pardon?
No discounts in the microgrid?
Yeah, I don't. We're not.
His question.
Yeah, no. I think.
Doing good discount?
Yeah, I don't know how they're pricing it. It's actually a third-party provider, but I think it's actually I think it's a positive for the residents. I think that's how that's working out. And the last thing I'll add, which this is really, I think, the most exciting. Val Jensen designed this, but we have an energy efficiency program for the residents that they can join one of our energy efficiency programs. If they save, call it $5, $10 off their bill on a month, they can liquidate it off their bill like they normally would, or we've created an app that allows them to transfer those savings to a church or a school or a community group. And so this idea of sort of the sharing economy and testing it through this energy efficiency program we think is pretty cool. We also have some education programs, curriculum that we've added into a couple of the schools out there. So again, trying to think holistically about, how do we support this localization trend? How do we work with communities to help them be decision makers in their energy future? And how do we play around with some technology that we love too? So
cool.
That's Bronzeville.
Okay, I think there's one more question, then I'm sure we'll have some questions from the floor. So there was recently an article in the Wall Street Journal that noted that distribution companies have an incredible, or especially high rate fraction of female CEOs. It's 20%. Retail is 7%, so you tripled your options.
It got better for me.
4% for capital goods, and then of course, sadly, economics is not so hot, 13%. What is it about distribution companies, and what could other industries, including economics, learn from your industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, but one thing I will say about our industry is I think we were, the industry's been fairly focused on diversity for a long time. I had a really interesting experience a few years ago at the Chicago Urban League Gala. They showed a video of a gentleman who talked about having gotten a job through the Urban League back in the 40s or 50s. And the job he got was with ComEd. And the thing that I was really proud of. But I was also proud that his granddaughter also works at ComEd. And so I think that our industry has felt itself a part of the communities in a way that not every business does. We're a universal service provider. We serve everyone. We don't have target markets. And so that connection with the community, that connection with all our constituencies, I think is important, and I think it's embedded in the industry, and that may have something to do with it.
Just that you sell to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to open the floor to questions. I think, are people writing them down, or are we're doing hands? Okay. So please state your name and.
My name is Tom.
Of course, there's the usual rule that. We're going to enforce that there's an actual question in the question.
My name is Thomas Lee. The title of your presentation was The Future of the Utility Industry.
Hi, Thomas.
Take us out 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years. What does it look like?
Yeah. So I think that it looks like, first of all, it will be renewable and it will be largely distributed. 15 years, 20 years out, no question about it. I think that is a path that we're on. I think it's inevitable. I think that's where we're going. I think that there will be many more options for sort of self-fueling than there are today. Much more customer control. The grid will be automated. As I said, we'll have sensors all over it, and all the decisions and grid will be, basically decisions will be made through automated and computerized switching. I think the transportation sector will be largely converted to electric. I mean, there's a chance that there's other multiple fuels out there, multiple clean fuels available. But I think, what I'm seeing out there in policy space right now from state to state is there's a big drive on electric vehicles. New Jersey has a bill right now pending, not passed, but pending, that basically converts every aspect of their transportation sector from private to state-owned vehicles to public transportation. And we're seeing more and more of those kinds of bills. So I think you'll see the transportation sector converted. I think you'll see much more connectivity between the grid and sort of what we think of standard electric use today, transportation, the industrial sector. It'll all be, much more, I think, connected into central nervous systems. Communication systems will rule. Fiber, we expect to see a lot more fiber out there in these systems. It's secure, much more secure to cyber than wireless systems are, although we'll see wireless systems as well. But this will all run off of communication systems, and it will be renewable and clean.
Don Mershon.
Hi, Don.
Hi, Ann. What a great presentation, by the way, both of you.
Thanks.
Electricity is fascinating because until recently it's been very hard to store in bulk. It's a unique commodity in that respect. So my question naturally is, how do you see the industry as a whole, the whole North American grid, affected by energy storage? And then what does Exelon view as advantages and disadvantages of that type of electrical storage?
Yeah, so we didn't really get to talk about that. I mean, Argonne is a leader in storage technology and really pushing the forefront of that, which is very exciting to have that right here in Chicago. Storage has a huge role to play in the future. I mean, that's been the one, sort of real challenge with this industry is the lack of storage, and we will see, more and more of that. One of the challenges is we don't seem to have enough storage. We haven't sort of gotten to the point where we have enough storage capacity to really sort of change the game. We've got, in fact, in Bronzeville, we've got a storage pilot right now where we call it a community energy storage system. I think it can keep, call it 7 or 8 houses running for a 3 or 4 hour period in terms of an outage. And so we're sort of at the stage where we don't have, big capacity storage, but there's breakthroughs happening. I know Argonne's had some real breakthroughs recently with some air, I think lithium ion, and it draws from the air. It's really quite a breakthrough. So we're seeing that, and we see much more of that in the future. We also are starting to see in policy space. I always say technology leads, but policy rules. Technology sort of pushes the front, but in regulated industries, it's policy that's going to set the economic rules of the game. Another policy trend we're seeing is states getting out there and setting goals for storage. But I think you'll see it both on the utility side, where we're doing things that help us manage the system and take and sort of rationalize the renewable assets in an optimal way for customers. And I think you'll also see it, on the customer side. But I think it's going to be more efficient and more effective if it's, in larger scale and managed that way. But customers will, there's the Tesla Powerwall is out there, and there's some takers on that for home systems. But I think we'll see it both customer side and utility side.
Yeah, actually, my view is in terms of getting rid of carbon out of the entire energy system, it all turns on the batteries. So until utility scale batteries can, price comes down much more, it's going to be very hard to really have very high levels of renewables And then the same thing with the electric vehicles, until the batteries have to come down in price to make them really comparable. It's the glue, yeah.
Real quick follow-up, with transportation going electrical, do you see that changing your demand curve? You say the future demand is flat or negative?
It does. It helps pick it up. It doesn't create a huge growth trajectory for us, but it does offset some of the decline in demand, and it will pick up a little bit of growth. I mean, I think we pick up a couple % on it, somewhere in that range, based on, yeah.
So I want to follow up on the gentleman's question over there, the first question, and then I also have one from the overflow room. But the follow-up question is just, you know, when you talked about the future of the grid, the world that you described of increasing distributed generation, more options for self-fueling, I mean, particularly among like commercial and industrial customers, you know, some people have described that as a humongous challenge for distribution utilities, that as more people are opting out of the grid and the cost you guys talked about of paying for all that infrastructure is getting spread over fewer and fewer customers, it incentivizes more people to leave the grid. Like, so how are you guys, how do you guys exist in that world, or what is the strategy?
Yeah, so there's a lot, you know, there's a big debate going on right now. I mean, there's sort of two world views. One is a completely distributed world, and the other is a connected world. And, you know, I'm sort of being provocative, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's, you know, sort of the debate, and they've called it the death spiral for the utility. I think the way we think about it is that and I think we have to do we have an obligation as an industry to you know, basically sort of create the narrative around the value we bring. But, you know, if you think about the economy and the economy being driven by, you know, networks. I mean, the internet is a huge network. It's the, you know, some of the most impactful foundational infrastructure in our economy. The grid is a network. What do networks do? They rationalize assets, create efficiencies. In the internet space, they can be market makers. They can animate markets. There's all these benefits that networks bring, and so we view ourselves in very much the same way. We think that we've got to find a way to use the benefits of the, you know, the network, but also allow for those, you know, more customized approaches and deliver to customers in that way. It is not easy. It is not easy because it disrupts, you know, so we've got the physical system to deal with, some of which I've described, but we've also got this economic system that's so, you know, it's basically socialized. And so how do we deal with that? And, you know, we're working on that. We think, you know, one answer is, you know, there's a subscription price for the grid. You know, there's a flat fee for the grid, and then everything else you pay for sort of by, you know, if you want a you know, clean energy component, it costs, you know, one price. If you want a different kind of energy mix, it would cost another price. If you want to, you know, take the benefit of energy efficiency programs, or, you know, these other items become sort of, you know, menu items, a la carte menu items. That's one way to think about it. We haven't proposed that yet, but we're thinking through this. It's not easy.
That's exactly what you said is so hard to do. You're talking about changing prices now.
Yeah.
And so there'll be winners and losers there. And it seems like the value that you're creating, which is the value, I guess, of the platform that connects people, that's not being adequately compensated, or it's hidden right now because
I think it's hidden.
It's in the volumetric charge.
Yes. And I think its attributes are not well understood. I mean, I think because people have looked at this as sort of a monolithic business. It's like, I turn my light switch on, I get electricity. When you think about all that goes into that and all the options around it, you know, it's a much more complex, you know, product or service than that. And I think that's part of it too, is we've got to be able to, as an industry, describe, you know, the value proposition and the, you know, the various attributes of value that we bring.
And so who's your target? I guess the target is the public utility commissions?
Well, I think
like, who has to be educated?
Well, I think that we have, you know, we have to speak to customers in the first instance, and you know, that is something that we recognize that we can do better. I mean, you know, basically, you know, the one aspect of the last 100 years that, you know, although I think we've had a great industry and delivered a great service, our role with the customer has largely been, you know, sort of a billing function, and we talk to you when there's an outage. And we haven't had sort of a normal, fully developed customer relationship, and I think that's something we recognize now that we must have. And so I think we have to talk to our customers and learn how to do that, and we absolutely, talking to the policymakers is critical as well.
And then the one from the overflow room kind of also follows up on the transportation question. What do you guys think are the 1 or 2 largest barriers to electrification of transportation?
Well, I think certainly, the battery issue and range with the battery, although, they're getting them into the 300-mile range now, which is, pretty darn good. So, but, certainly the range, range and price, although prices are, battery prices are starting to come down. And the infrastructure question, the charging infrastructure and how available it is, and consumers being able to think about how you travel from one place to another and get the vehicle recharged, and how do you plan for that. I think all of that sort of infrastructure question and how do you deal with infrastructure is a big part of it. But I will say, I wanted to make another comment on electric transportation, and that is we've focused almost exclusively, not entirely, but almost exclusively on private vehicle ownership. And yet we serve cities. In my company, we serve, major cities in the US, and Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia are the top 3 cities in the US for public transit use. And so if you think of Chicago at 28% of the population using public transit, and Washington, D.C. at like 37%, we have to be talking more about public transit. If we're going to talk about the equitable distribution of benefits of a clean economy, we've got to start talking about public transit and making the transition on public transit. And that is something that we're trying to drive, again, as an urban-based utility company. We think that's really, really important.
Okay, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
You mentioned trying to bring in other customers that work in other fields that aren't currently electrified. I wonder to what extent that, like batteries, the ability to dispatch that load is useful to your company in handling the inputs from variable renewables. And how big does it have to be? Does it have to be as big as the current variation in demand?
How big do the batteries have to be, or how much?
Well, there are other forms of dispatchable load.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think we're thinking about all of that. And that's part of the reason why this having sort of a grid that runs on artificial intelligence, automation becomes so important, because we're going to have so many variables. I say, first of all, what's happening to our industry is we no longer control the supply side. Third parties control that. And the demand side, which has been pretty predictable for 100 years, is completely unpredictable. And we're giving customers the tools to make it more unpredictable. So your supply side just went like this, and your demand side just went like this, and your grid in the middle, better be able to sort all that out. But we absolutely fully expect and encourage, customers to take hold of that. And we'll see that. There'll be customers with storage, and they'll be discharging onto the system, and there'll be customers that will take advantage of real-time pricing, which I know Michael's a fan of, and tie it to appliances, and we'll see all that volatility on the system.
I think we had a question here.
Thank you. Talking about battery storage, and that question goes a little bit beyond generation distribution. What do you think of the lifetime of batteries, and what happens at the end of the life of a battery, and how we dispose batteries in terms of environmental impact when we talk about climate change?
Yeah. Obviously, it's something we have to think about, and I actually think that is something that Argonne, one of the projects at Argonne right now, is looking at the life cycle of a battery and how we think about recycling. I think that's absolutely critical. There's a bit of a movement afoot of thinking about renewable products, not just energy, but how, with all the plastic problems, that we're now seeing in the ocean, how do we think about renewable products? And I think that is a, absolutely critical part of how we think about sustainability in the future, and batteries certainly a part of that. But, again, having, that kind of research being done right here in Chicago, I think is really exciting.
Okay, I think we had a final question.
Yes, my name is Michael Stady.
Hi, Michael.
And my question is on your networks, the nodes, are they all physical nodes that the electricity can't get in, or are they virtual nodes just in computers? That may be a technical question that you don't imagine.
Yeah, I mean, right now they're physical.
They are physical nodes.
I'm looking at Joe
Yeah, I think
or Terry.
when you talk of nodes, we're thinking of that you move this, the transmission system has locational marginal pricing. If you tried to apply that to the distribution system, there's some 5,000 circuits just on the ComEd system, and there's multiple phases. It just becomes almost unwieldy, right? So we've tried to just do some modeling and working with some of the engineering organizations. If you apply them at the buses or distributed points on the feeders.
Modeling implies virtual.
Right. Right, virtual so that one day it may be real, right? So it's, yeah.
Okay.
I knew I'd have to use my lifeline here at some point. Thank you, Joe.
You covered a lot of space here, so thank you very much. Please
Thanks.
join me.
My pleasure. Thanks.